We're going to talk about a battle that was very unusual and kind of sets the stage for American history 80 years later, and that was the Battle of Kings Mountain that was fought in North Carolina on October 7, 1780. And I think I didn't tell this class, I told the other class. In this battle, what you have is you have more than 2,000 men fighting each other in this battle. More than 2,000 men are fighting on both sides in the Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780. Now here's the significance of the Battle of Kings Mountain, which was fought in North Carolina. And it was part of the Revolutionary War. It was British against American colonists. The thing that was unusual, in this battle, of the 2,000 men that are fighting on both sides, guess how many are British soldiers? Guess how many are British soldiers?
1,000.
One. Which tells you that you have colonial militia fighting loyalist militia. You have, in essence, in this country, on October 7th, 1780, with the Battle of Kings Mountain, a sneak preview of what? That happens 80 years later, the Civil War.
1,000 were British?
One.
One. Oh,
So you had brother against brother, so to speak, family against family. You have a sneak preview in the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780 of what's going to happen 80 years later, and that was the Civil War. In this battle, it was American militia versus loyalist militia. Only one British soldier took part in the Battle of Kings Mountain. And what you have, kiddos, is you have a prelude or a sneak preview of America's history in 80 years when we had an American Civil War. That's pretty incredible when you think about it. That tells you the number of loyalists that were in the South. It gives you an idea.
1,990.
There were about, I don't know the exact number on each side, but I know that only one of those 2,000 was a British soldier. Okay, that's going to take us to kind of an interesting subtopic and another lost person in American history. That's colonial prisoners of war. What have they been doing with all of these men that they've been capturing, especially the British? So I'm going to talk about colonial prisoners of war, okay? Now, as that Revolutionary War moved to the South, there are thousands of colonial soldiers being held as prisoners of war by the British. So as the war has moved to the South, there are thousands of colonial soldiers that are being held prisoner of war by the British. Now, they have been captured from every battle we've talked about. Okay? Colonial soldiers have been captured in just about every battle we've talked about. And where are they putting these colonial soldiers? They're putting them on 16 retired British warships. They are all storing these prisoners of war on 16 retired British warships. Anybody want to guess where these 16 ships are anchored that we've talked about?
Sure.
Specifically, you're close. On the East River. They're on the East River. Okay? They're in New York Harbor on the East River. They're all anchored there. 16 of them. Their masts, you know what that makes them sail? They've been taken down. Any canvas, any rigging that makes the ship sail has been taken down, and the gun ports, you know, the holes where the cannons are out of, have all been sealed. And these prisoners of war are inside the hull of these 16 retired British warships. They stripped down the mast, they stripped down the canvas, taken all the rigging off, and they plugged or blocked the holes that cannons once pointed out of. Now, to give you an idea of the conditions for these poor prisoners of war, when these British ships were fighting, they held a crew of about 350 men. Okay? They held a crew of about 350 men when these were functional fighting ships. You know how many are on the ship now? In each ship? 1,400. So you can imagine exactly what this is like. So in their glory days, these British ships carried a crew of approximately 350 men, and some of these 16 ships that are now docked in the East River have as many as 1,400 prisoners below deck. Below deck with the gun ports closed. If you guys think that these football players stink down the hallway, you ought to be in that place. I bet that's something else. Now, the only people that were witness to this, other than the British guards that guarded them, was a humanitarian by the name of Elizabeth Burgeon. Elizabeth Burgeon was the only other person that was witness to this travesty of the prisoners of war on the colonial side. Elizabeth Burgeon. And she was a humanitarian that they allowed to bring food, supplies, and some comfort to those men. And the only reason they let her do it is because she was a woman humanitarian. Okay, they didn't think that she could cause them any harm or do anything that would mess up their system. So the British did allow a colonial humanitarian by the name of Elizabeth Burgeon to see the prisoners. She allowed them to bring them some food, supplies, and some comfort if they needed it, and they did it only because she was a woman. So no others were allowed to perform those duties. She was the only one. So she's the only witness to what's going on these ships other than the British guards. Now, she was just horrified at the conditions in which these men were held, and I'll give you some examples of how bad it was. She was just horrified at the conditions in which these men were held prisoner. First of all, they were fed undercooked meat with wormy bread. They were fed undercooked meat with wormy bread. Number two, as you can imagine, because of the conditions, disease was just rampant among the prisoners. It was a disease-filled environment. Disease was rampant among the prisoners, a disease-filled environment. Now, you think about this. The air was so thick below deck because there was virtually no ventilation. You couldn't light a candle because of the lack of oxygen. You couldn't even get a candle to burn because there was such a lack of oxygen underneath the deck. So the air was so thick below the deck, there's virtually no ventilation. A candle could not be lit because of the lack of oxygen. And because of this particular environment, men were dying daily. Actually, 10 to 12 a day were dying. 10 to 12 a day because of these conditions. So undercooked meat with wormy bread, disease, no ventilation. As I mentioned, the air was so thick you couldn't even light a candle below deck and have it continue to burn. And because of these conditions, as many as 10 to 12 colonial prisoners of war died daily. Each morning would begin for the prisoners with the same grim command. The British guards would open up from the deck. They would open up underneath the ship and they would yell, "Rebel! Rebels, turn out your dead." So they made the rebels find the dead underneath the ship and bring them out. So on a daily basis, each morning, it would begin for the prisoners with the same grim command from British guards, "Rebels, turn out your dead." And those dead were taken off the ships and buried right on the shoreline. Buried right on the shoreline. Every morning, 10 to 12 were brought out and buried on the shoreline. Now, did these prisoners have a chance to get out? They actually did. All they would have to do is join the British Navy and swear their allegiance to the king, and they would have set them free on the spot. All they had to do was join the British Navy and swear their allegiance to the king. If they did that, they would immediately be set free. By the way, almost to a man, these men chose agonizing death rather than to become a traitor to the American colonies. Very few hardly any document that took them up on that offer. Now backing up a little bit, this might seem like a gross duty, but a lot of these prisoners of war volunteered to take those dead off of the ship and what? Bury them, because what did it do? It gave them a chance to get out and get some air. So a lot of them, that's a gruesome job, but many volunteered for that. Not all of them got a chance. It was an honor, or not an honor, but a real privilege to get a chance to get off the ship and be involved in that duty, if you can imagine. Now, there virtually was no way to escape. The possibility of escape was nearly impossible, very risky. The only way that's going to help is if they get some help from the outside. That's the only way. They're not going to get out otherwise. Well, this outside help's going to come in the form of what? Elizabeth Virgin. Elizabeth Virgin's going to supply this outside help. So this outside help to get out is going to come in the form of Elizabeth Virgin. She actually had devised a plan to free the prisoners of war that were housed on those ships. Now, this is it's amazing what they think of clear back in this time period. What Elizabeth Virgin conjures up is she smuggled in drugs, and she gave them to a prisoner inside a book that she brought him to read, with instructions to slip the drugs into the guard's beer at night to leave him incapacitated. So she actually went and got drugs that they had drugs at those times, different type of drugs, and she snuck these drugs inside a book that she brought to one of these prisoners to read, and you had instructions that, and the guard's not looking because they were off guard. These guys were no threat to them in the condition they were in. And they said, slip these drugs into the guard's beer and it'll leave him incapacitated, we'll try to escape. Well, it worked. These guards this plan began to go into place. The guard would consume the drug in his beer, he would pass out, and the key to the topside opening was taken by the prisoners. And as a result of this successful endeavor, many men escaped into waiting boats provided by Miss Virgin and her Patriot followers. So she actually made this thing work. Did she get all of those prisoners out? No, she didn't get them all out. But she rescued, they estimate, as many as 200 in the next few weeks before she was discovered by British officials. So she got away with this for a period of time in which 200 men actually escaped using her plan of drugging up the guards by putting it in their beer. So it was estimated that she rescued as many as 200 prisoners in the next few weeks using those exact same tactics until she was discovered. Well, this is how ticked off the British were. They immediately put a price on her head. Okay, they put out a reward, and the price was 200 British pounds. Okay, and that means nothing to you until I tell you the significance. So they put a price on her head. Dead or alive, bring her back. Rewards 200 pounds. 200 pounds was as much as a British soldier made if he spent 20 years in the military. So it was a pretty good bunch of money that was offered for her head. So the British immediately put a price on Elizabeth Virgin's head of 200 pounds. That's as much as a British soldier would earn in 20 years of service. Well, she actually escaped from New York, was never caught. And after the Revolutionary War ended in favor of the Americans, George Washington gave her a military pension for the rest of her life for her heroics. George Washington gave her a military pension after the war for her contribution to the Revolution. It's like a retirement, like so much a month retirement, yeah. That's pretty cool, yeah. So how many ever heard of Elizabeth Virgin? There's another gal that made a huge difference in the Revolutionary War. Now, just to give you a few more statistics. During the course of the American Revolution, I'm going to give you a little prelude here, they estimated that somewhere between 8,000 and 85 colonial patriots were killed in battle. Okay? During the American Revolution, they estimated between 8,000 and 8,500 American patriots were killed in battle during the whole revolution. During that same course of time, you know how many died in prison? 11,500. More colonial soldiers died in prison than were killed on the battlefield. So again, during the Revolutionary War, it was estimated between 8,000 and 8,500 colonial patriots were killed. During that same course of time, they estimated that approximately 11,500 colonists died in prison ships. Isn't that incredible? That's how bad the conditions were. Any questions on that? Okay, we'll talk about another battle. Our subtopic is continued failure in the South. American soldiers are getting crushed in the South, folks. They're getting crushed. American failure in the South. Well, as the Revolutionary War rages in the South, American soldiers are falling in alarming numbers. We're not doing very well. Okay? We're getting beat up a little. Well, on August 16th of 1780, in South Carolina, there was another battle called the Battle of Camden. Battle of Camden in South Carolina on August 16th, 1780. And in this Battle of Camden, you have approximately 4,000 American patriots attacking 2,500 British soldiers. So on August 16th of 1780, the Battle of Camden in South Carolina commences, and approximately 4,000 American patriots launch a major attack against 2,500 British soldiers. Now, even though the Patriots outnumber the British, they're really no match for them. And the man commanding the British at the Battle of Camden is General Charles Cornwallis. British General Charles Cornwallis is commanding British troops at Camden. And even though they outnumber them 4,000 to 2,500, they really aren't going to stand a chance here. They don't believe. Well, to make a long story short, again, the Americans get defeated at Camden, but partly it was self-inflicted. Their defeat was partly self-inflicted. What does that mean? Sully?
They probably made some sort of major mistake.
Yeah, dumb mistake to compromise. Very good, Adir. Well, what happened is they were hungry. And the day before the battle, they were starving, these colonial patriot soldiers. And they found a stash of peaches. And they ate them like crazy because they were hungry. The problem was they were not ripe yet. Okay? But they were so hungry they just jumped into these peaches, which were unripe, and it caused many of the men to become deathly ill during the battle. You don't fight well. Battle's tough enough if you're healthy. If you're sicker than a dog because you ate a bunch of unripe peaches, it's even worse. Now, there's no doubt that their sickness contributed to their loss. They estimated that about 2,000 patriots were either killed, wounded, or captured during the Battle of Camden. About 2,000 of the 4,000 patriots were either killed, wounded, or captured during the Battle of Camden. Well, the colonial soldiers see that they're licked in this battle, and as they run and retreat from the British advance, they desperately attempt to pick up as much equipment as possible in their retreat because they don't want any of their supplies and equipment to fall into British hands. So as they're retreating, they're picking up weapons, they're picking up ammunition, they're picking up supplies that they do not want the British to accumulate after the Battle of Camden. Now, one of these colonial soldiers who's retreating is a supersized patriot by the name of Peter Francisco. Supersized patriot by the name of Peter Francisco. He was known as the Virginia Giant. Now, you got to remember, at this time in history, men were much smaller. You know what I mean? They just were. We didn't have real big, tall people. Okay? And one of the men that was retreating, trying to accumulate some of this equipment, weapons, was a patriot by the name of Peter Francisco, known as the Virginia Giant. He stood 6'6", which was very tall in those days, and weighed 280 pounds. He was a huge man. And that was very unusual, so he stuck out. That's why he got the nickname the Virginia Giant. Okay? Now, we know history from written accounts. Now, I couldn't tell you if this was 100% true, but several written accounts state that Peter Francisco picked up a cannon that weighed 1,100 pounds during the retreat, put it on his shoulders, and kept the British from getting it. One of the most powerful weapons that they had with them at the time that they did not want the British to have. According to written accounts, Francisco picked up this cannon, which weighed about 1,100 pounds, hoisted it up on his shoulders, and hid it from the British. George Washington was so impressed with Peter Francisco, he referred to the man as a one-man army. George Washington was so impressed with Peter Francisco that he referred to him as a one-man army. Now, nobody even knew how the heck he got to America. The best guess was they believed he was born in Portugal. But nobody had a clue how he got to America. Nobody knows the history of Peter Francisco enough to know how or why he ended up in America. But he was a fearless and ferocious soldier. But despite his efforts, the British continued to press in the South. Okay? Peter Francisco. So happens that we have a stamp with him on it. So I'm going to give you one of these stamps, and I want you to take this stamp and put it in your notes where we talked about Peter Francisco. He had to be kind of a big deal if they made a stamp out of him, didn't he? Peter Francisco. You'll be the only gal in Sweden with these stamps. I just want you to know, my dear.